Theories of music make him surprised to learn that the notion of music was broader than it is today. We think of music theory as pitches and rhythm. Theorists of Middle Ages saw it as patterns that govern life and cosmos. Their description of music from this perspective is called speculative theory. They drew from thinking of ancient Greek philosophers. And one of the most influential medieval theorists was St. Augustine, known as the Bishop of Hippo. His treatise De Musica, about music, addressed rhythm and meter and described music as art of measuring well, and it was widely circulated. But as far as the church was concerned, Augustine's discussion of music in his Confessions was even more significant. Those are two things you need to remember from St. Augustine: De Musica and Confessions. And Augustine's Confessions is still widely known and read and referred to. Augustine recognized music could offer sensory pleasures, and he began to worry: when I find the singing itself more moving than the truth which it conveys, I confess it is a grievous sin. Nevertheless, having thought about this problem carefully, he concluded, I am inclined to approve of the custom of singing in church, because he explained that when words are sung, they kindle in me a more ardent flame of piety than they would if not. In short, Augustine decides that music intensifies the message of poetry, so the church was given an endorsement to create melodies for sacred texts. About a century later, Boethius, the Roman who served in Theodoric's court, wrote De Institutione Musica, on the organization of music. This became the most widely studied treatise of its time. He translated Greek writings about music, drawing parallels, here we go, between the past and music of his era. For the rest of the medieval world, Boethius provided the majority of knowledge about ancient Greek music theory, although he created confusion between mode and key. And in the manner of medieval speculative theorists, Boethius also believed there were relationships between the universe and music. He divided music into three dimensions, which he called the highest order musica mundana, music of the spheres. You couldn't hear this music, but it describes orderly motion of stars and planets in the cosmos. Second dimension, musica humana, also couldn't be heard, but it was apparent in the harmonious relationship between human body and soul. And Boethius's term for the third aspect, musica instrumentalis, was the type that we today think of as music, the audible sounds produced by voices and instruments. Boethius's focus was on the acoustical principles of these sounds. And for hundreds of years, these conceptions of music's influence on the cosmos and human health and behavior were taught in medieval universities, and they were the subject of renewed investigation in the Renaissance. All right, music in the Catholic Church. As the Catholic Church grew in power and forged strategic alliances with political rulers, it also developed ways of regulating its methods of worship. And over the centuries, religious services grew more formal and began to follow increasingly standardized patterns. Different rituals were observed depending on the season of the year. And collectively, these worship services, all the worship services in the Catholic Church, are called the liturgy. And the people who followed the liturgy most strictly were those living in monasteries and convents. Regulating it. There were virtually no guidelines to regulate daily life, as is the case for virtually any community. However, some system was eventually needed. And the abbot of one Italian monastery, St. Benedict of Nursia, wrote an extensive set of directives to guide monks. He told them what time services should take place. He provided guidelines for the contents of the services and even the number of psalms that should be sung. And he listed rules for the monks' behaviors, how much to eat and drink, and so forth. And this instruction book became known as the Rule of St. Benedict. It was enormously influential in shaping the practices of other monastic institutions. And when more and more began to follow the same worship patterns, the Catholic liturgy became standardized, with two types of services occurring daily: Mass and offices. The cornerstone of worship for Catholics is the daily Mass. In the Middle Ages, it usually took place in mid-morning, and the service contains a symbolic reenactment of the Last Supper, when Christ ate with his disciples for the final time. The bread and wine represents the body and blood of Christ. So during communion, portion of Mass, bread and wine are shared. Various prayers, readings, and declarations are uttered, all occurring in a strict pattern that was standardized by the 9th century. Some of these are sung to distinctive melodies, which are called chants. Other items are merely read aloud, although sometimes a priest leading the Mass may recite the text using a formula that centers on a single repetitive pitch. And the typical order of a Mass is shown here. And here you have chants, and you have two types of chants, proper and ordinary. We'll go over that in a second. And then the prayers and the lessons. So you start with the introit, and then you would have some kind of chant, and then the collect, and then the lesson, and then all these other little things. Okay. All right. Offices. For ordinary Catholics, attendance at Sunday Mass is customary. Extremely devout worshipers might attend daily. However, 8 other services called offices or divine offices take place each day. These services are shorter, focuses on psalms and various lessons and prayers. The offices also occur on a predetermined schedule, taking place roughly every 3 hours throughout the day and night. Sometimes they're referred to as the hours or canonical hours. And almost exclusively the attendees at these are monks and nuns, since it would be difficult for anyone not living the monastic life to devote so much time to these services, especially since Matins is at 2 a.m. Okay, and again, these would have been observed in St. Benedict's time, and he would be the one who was credited with creating the schedule. People have behaved like people for centuries, so it's not a surprise to learn that sleepy monks were sometimes late for services, particularly in the middle of the night. And in his rule, St. Benedict tried to build in a grace period for late arrivals, but he also had specific punishments. All right, these are the offices. These are the little sessions that pretty much monks and nuns would attend. You see, Matin starts at 2 a.m. That's the first one. Instead of good morning, good Matin. Lauds, 3 hours later. And then you have prime, terce, sext, and none, occurring 3 hours after each one. Vespers, and then compline. And then you get to go to bed at 6 o'clock. But then again, you're up at 2 a.m. So that's the life. And this was the punishment. If any arrives at Matins after the Gloria of Psalms, and on account of this, the psalm should be chanted slowly, he is not to take place in the choir. He shall go rather to the last place or somewhere visible set aside by the abbot for dilatory monks, so that all may see him. He will remain until after the divine office and make amends by public penance. We have decided the above in order that the embarrassment will make the reform. If they remain outside the oratory, the room where the service is held, they may fall asleep or indulge in idle chatter, thus giving the devil an opportunity. The lesser offices lasted for about 15 minutes each, and the greater offices may run a bit longer, perhaps up to half an hour on important days during the church year. Proper and ordinary. Church year is also known as the liturgical year and cycles through annual religious holidays that are central to the Catholic faith and the seasons that surround them. Most widely recognized are Christmas and Easter. Other seasons lead up to or follow important feast days. Feast in this usage does not refer to a large meal, but rather is derived from the same root for festival days. When the Mass and office services, some prayers remain exactly the same every time. These consistent texts are called ordinary, since they don't change from day to day. In contrast, the words of some prayers and readings change every day, and these are designated as proper. Proper comes from the same root as appropriate, so it might be easiest to think of proper text as being appropriate for particular services. For example, Mass always begins with an introit, and an introit is a proper chant. Therefore, in the Christmas Mass, the first words of the introit are Puer natus est, a child is born, which is certainly appropriate for nativity season. In contrast, the first word of the introit that opens for Easter is resurrex, he is risen. and that's suitable for that occasion, but not suitable for other times of the years. Some of the proper items are seasonal. For instance, during the penitential season of Lent, a tract replaces the usual hallelujah, since a hallelujah seems too joyful for that solemn time of year. And just as in Mass, each office has particular components that remain constant or ordinary, while other chants change, so they are proper to a certain season. An analogy to the Catholic's liturgy, use of ordinary and proper, might be seen in high schools when we use the intercom system. Most of the announcements begin with a repetition of the Pledge of Allegiance and followed by current events. So the Pledge of the Allegiance is ordinary since it's always said, and the notifications would be proper since they will vary. And this is where we will end